one of the conclusions I drew is thinking along those same lines. Because you go to China and you realize, you know, first of all, they're trying to industrialize in a way that took us 120 years. They're trying to do it in 20.
Yes.
And they're trying to do it, so they're trying to do it 5 times as fast, at 5 times the scale, and for 5 times as many people. So they probably appropriately feel entitled to do the same, to go through the same learning curve we went through over 120 years in terms of balancing emissions with growth. And I took away from that that the only way we're going to, and they've learned to talk a good game about managing those emissions, but when I say a sense of national purpose, it is they are all on message. They are all on message. The message and the reality did not look to me like they were in sync. But again, I was only there for a week. When it comes to carbon, which I care about, I asked the question on the last day, do the things they have to do to control, to manage their ambient air pollution problems also contribute to managing their CO2 emissions? And the answer is, for the most part, they don't, which is where this question of carbon capture comes in. Things that, because I believe I agree with you, the solution long term is to find cheaper sources of energy that are clean. For this association, the problem is, capturing carbon, unless the market for the captured carbon more than pays for the cost of capturing it, is just an expense that addresses an abstraction, potentially a life-threatening, globe-threatening abstraction, but for the immediate term, when the people having to make the decisions about balancing cost of energy and the growth that provides versus emissions, it may be a life-threatening abstraction in the long term, but right now they got life-threatening hunger. And so if you can produce energy more cheaply and lift people out of poverty in the process, the life-threatening abstraction of CO2 emissions in the future is not a persuasive one to you. What that pushed me in the direction of is, while pollution controls that add cost to energy, generally that would reduce ambient pollution, generally don't reduce CO2 emissions, so you're not getting the double whammy. New energy technologies based on renewable sources that don't emit either CO2 or ambient air pollutants do give you that double whammy, and do have the potential in the long term to be cheaper than the polluting sources of energy. So that's where the innovation, to me, I mean, that's not the message that Carbon Capture and Storage Association really wants to hear. But the problem is that's a cost added to energy to address an abstract fear, right? And I don't see how you're going to convince them to invest in it. I just don't see how you're gonna when they're trying to lift 1 billion more people out of poverty.
And that's why I think the focus on those new technologies and those energy efficiencies, those measures that use the same unit of energy more effectively, that's where you get the dual benefit of reducing pollutants of health and environmental concern, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are there. And so if you don't, if you look at just going after carbon reductions, those are going to necessarily be an additional cost, which you pointed out. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that I've been pleased, and I think that Texas is well situated to be leaders, as I think they already are with regard to EOR, is to utilize the potential for improving and developing and increasing the efficiency of carbon capture such that while it can be used in conjunction with enhanced oil recovery, because you minimize those costs by creating a product that's useful. Currently I've heard numbers from 18 to 30% of the energy produced at a power plant would be required to capture the carbon. And so the point that you were making is any of that energy that's parasitic from that standpoint, that goes into capturing pollutant or reducing pollutants, will necessarily decrease the efficiency from an economic standpoint. And in the case of the carbon capture, if you're going to increase on a per unit generated, you're going to increase the emissions of those toxics and those other pollutants that we have concern with. And frankly, one of the issues that we have in the United States directly with China is that a large portion of the elemental mercury that we get deposited in the United States comes from China. Less than 10% of the elemental nitrogen, elemental mercury deposited in the United States is from generation in the United States and Canada. And so, in fact, I think the U.S. is like 2% of the when you include power generation and all other sources. So the elemental mercury problem we have in the United States is typically an Asian problem, and it's continuing to escalate. And a concern I have is that as we push for globally reductions in greenhouse gas that don't find the right balance and or don't rely heavily on cleaner fuels and or a more effective way of ensuring that we're going to reduce mercury emissions overseas, those are going to continue to lead to environmental issues here in the United States that we have no control over, have a very difficult time. And our focus has typically not been, on the international treaty standpoint, has not been in trying to reduce those mercury emissions in Asia, but instead focused on greenhouse gas and others that are a lot more difficult to quantify, and quite frankly the science about how much concern ought to be given to what types of emissions is not really sound and settled enough that we can say we can place a value, for example, on reducing greenhouse gases. We certainly know the impact of some of the other emissions that have health impacts locally in Asia and China and others, but certainly those that also carry across the trade winds and impact our United States.
I think this is the point that many of us came away from China with, which is CO2 may be an issue in the long, long run. And the Earth may get hit by a meteor in 100 years, but I'm most concerned about my child having breathing problems next week. And so I would prefer, if there is unlimited capital in the world, and I think it's limited. The Chinese appear to have a lot of our money, and so maybe it's unlimited. But if there's limited capital in the world, I prefer to see it deployed in addressing the ambient air quality issues that we've been working on here for a long time. The SO2, NOx, mercury, all those things that we have focused our attention on, and your agency in particular, and spent a lot of money on. You know, let's stop the bleeding first. Let's stabilize the patient, and then perhaps we can address some of the longer